Let's move on to verse 10. Moving along. This is this begins the categorical section of the word of wisdom with herbs. And again, verily I say unto you, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. Every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof, all these to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. All wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution and nature and use of man. That's referenced, I think, in D&C 49 and 59 as well. Every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof, all these to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. So this isn't really talking about how to use them, but that they were created for our benefit, and our attitude towards using them, that we need to do it with thanksgiving, prudence and thanksgiving. So that's grains, 10 and 11. We're going to come back to that. Let's move on. Verses 12, now we get into the second category, which is meat. Yea, flesh also of beasts and the fowls of the air, I the Lord have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. This seems to echo the sentiment among vegetarians that it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. So we should be vegetarians unless it's winter, cold, or famine, according to how it reads right there. But we're going to come back to that, okay? Now we move on to grains. All grain is ordained for the use of man and of beasts to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. And these hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess hunger. There's no mention of winter there, which is interesting. All grain is good for the food of man, and also the fruit of the vine, which yieldeth fruit, whether in the ground or above the ground. So, question is, verse 15, and these, is that referring to the wild animals that run and creep on the earth, or grains? It seems like we're in the grain section, but is God talking about grains, or is he talking about animals? Well, going back to verses 13, it seems to clear that, and it's pleasing unto me that they, animals, should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. Okay, so how it reads there, we should be vegetarians except in times of winter, cold, or famine, or in 15, in times of famine and excess hunger. Otherwise, we should be eating other than meat, fruits and vegetables, other things. That's how it reads, all right? Well, let's move on. We're going to come back to that. So it seems that if we're trying to sort out where cannabis, marijuana, fits in these categorical sections, the only section that it would even come close to fitting into is herbs. Whether it's a wholesome herb or a detrimental, toxic herb depends on how you use it, I suppose. But that could be said also for a lot of different things, for sugar, for carbs, for anything else. But marijuana is classified as an herb. If it is a wholesome herb, then verse 11 categorizes its use. So, and again, verily I say unto you, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. And every herb in the season thereof, every fruit in the season thereof, all these to be used with prudence. That's probably the key to using marijuana and any other herb or any other substance, is to use it with prudence and thanksgiving. That would probably be the difference between recreational and medical, getting back to that. And I wonder if the church is basing their current policy on this reading of the word of wisdom. I don't know, because they don't reference the word of wisdom at all in their public statements. However, we're coming full circle back to the church's policy, and there is justification for advocating for medical use and not recreational use. I think the better way to categorize that and explain that and articulate the position based on doctrinal reading of D&C 89 is to use it with prudence and thanksgiving, and not in any way that would be detrimental to your mental or physical health or any other negative aspect of your life. And I think that can't be categorized simply as recreational or medical, because people get prescriptions medicinally for things like opioids, which has blown up into a huge epidemic, and they're using it medicinally, and it's having a huge detrimental effect on their lives and and the lives of their families and everyone around them. Same with, there's probably recreational users out there that use it to a degree that helps them be more agreeable and possibly combat things in their lives that they don't know how to deal with otherwise. Things like anxiety and stress and other things like that. So I just don't think we can draw a clean line between medicinal use and recreational use. I think if we look to the scriptures, and we'll go into D&C 49 also right after this, with the verbiage that the Lord chooses to be used with judgment and skill, are some of the verbs he used, also to be used with prudence. Things can be good, even wholesome herbs, even marijuana, if it's used with judgment and skill, with prudence and things like that. So that's a longer explanation than simply medicinal versus recreational, but I think that explanation is valid and necessary for understanding specifically God's view on it. So, meat section. The meat section talks about this restriction only in times of winter, cold, or famine. Now, the red flag that this automatically raises is who actually observes that part of the word of wisdom. That caller that called into Larry King Live and pressed President Hinckley on that was a very good question, because I don't know anybody who has given a second thought to that meat restriction. In fact, I've never come across any manual in all the years of my church, anybody that's even taught anything about restricting meat in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the church has a huge cattle ranch, or many cattle ranches, and is involved in the slaughter for consumption of cattle meat, of beef. And so I don't know where this comes from. I mean, the cultural interpretation of this, how we can just completely disregard this aspect of the word of wisdom. Nobody regards it as something binding or important, definitely not on the degree to which alcohol, tobacco, tea, and coffee are. And yet there are more verses devoted to this than there are to those specifically, especially if you take into account D&C 49 and 89 and 59 together. So, restriction on meat. When should we eat it? Well, D&C 49 states this: "And whoso forbiddeth to abstain from meats, that man should not eat the same, is not ordained of God. For behold, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, and that which cometh of the earth is ordained for the use of man, for food and raiment, and that he might have in abundance. Wow, we seem to have a major contradiction here between D&C 49 and 89. 89 putting restrictions on the use of meat, eat it sparingly and only in times of winter or cold or famine. And 49 says that whoso forbiddeth to abstain from meats, that man should not eat the same, is not ordained of God. And goes on to say that all of these things were ordained for the use of man for food, that he might have in abundance. There's obviously a contradiction here, because D&C 49, which predates 89, puts no restriction on the eating of meat. Leviticus 10 is another place that I found a reference to eating meat. 10:12, and Moses spake unto Aaron and unto Eleazar and unto Ithamar, his sons that were left, take the meat offering that remaineth of the offerings of the Lord made by fire, and eat it without leavened bread besides the altar, for it is most holy. And ye shall eat it in a holy place, because it is thy due and thy son's due of the sacrifices of the Lord made by fire, for so I am commanded. Again, consumption of meat there seems to be a holy thing associated with temple worship. So why is 89 taking this departure from the other scriptures regarding meat, putting restrictions on it and forbidding man to eat it unless it's cold, winter, or you're starving? There seems to be a contradiction, right? Well, this section on grains restates this position. All grain is ordained for the use of man and beasts, to be the staff of life. What is a staff? You know, that's an interesting word to me. A staff is a stick that you lean on when you're weary. It's to support you when you're weary, like in times of cold, winter, or famine, or when you are weak. It's the staff to lean on. It says, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field, and for the fowls of heaven, and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. And these hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine, excess of hunger. So is these referring to those animals, or is these referring to the grains? It seems to be referring to the grains, because we're in the grains section, that these grains are the staff that you lean on in time, only in times of famine and excess of hunger. No mention of cold or winter. It's hard to be a vegetarian only in times of famine or only in the winter. That's very confusing. All grain, see, we're still in the grain section. All grain is good for the food of man, and also the fruit of the vine, that which yieldeth fruit, whether in the ground or above the ground. So these verses seem to be tripping over themselves. What is going on? Well, to understand the story of the word of wisdom, we need to insert a third player other than Joseph Smith and God, and that is scribes. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you where this contradiction comes from and actually identify scribes playing a role here in this story in a very significant way. Okay, so here we are. This is the Joseph Smith Papers archive. And what's cool about this is they have in here the image of the actual transcript that was recorded by Sidney Gilbert, which is probably the best and earliest original document that we have. So we can go through this and see if any changes have been made. And we're looking for verses 12 and 13. It's not divided into verses, but here's strong drink. Strong drinks undergo tobacco. It's not for use of man. Again, hot drinks. Go to the next page. Okay. So here we go. Flesh also of beasts and of fowls, I, the Lord, hath ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. They are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter. Okay, you see here, we're missing something that's in our scriptures. What it says is that they are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto me. First of all, that's all one sentence. Pleasing unto me that they shall not be used only in times of winter or of famine. In our scriptures, we have a comma right here between used and only. And what that does is it completely changes the meaning. So with the comma right there, it says, regarding flesh of beasts, it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used, comma, only in times of winter or of famine. But you take that comma out, and it reads, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of famine. You see, without that comma, it completely reverses the meaning, saying that they should be used all the times, not only in times of cold, winter, or famine. Now, this comma not being here changes the meaning, and then if we go back to verses 13 and 14 and how that reads, then we get this, that the section in grains makes sense. And all grain is ordained for the use of man and of beast to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for beasts of the field and fowls of heaven, and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. And these grains hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess of hunger. So we're in the grains section. All of a sudden, those verses have a different meaning. These is referencing grains and not meat. And so it completely changes the meat and grains usage, and that makes sense because grains can be stored for times of famine, excess hunger, cold, or winter. Just like Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, who became Pharaoh's servant, stored up grains for times of famine, for the 7-year famine that saved his household and all of Egypt. Grains can be stored for cold, winter, famine, or excess hunger. Meat is a lot harder to store up for those times. And so, man, that comma sure changes things. And I tell you, it's not there. In this transcript, it reads, there's no comma in between the used and only. And then the other, I'm not going to pull it up, but then the other early transcript of section 89 is the one that was sent to the printers for the Book of Commandments. And it doesn't contain any punctuation, but it also doesn't have the comma as well. So the first two early manuscripts don't have this comma, and because of that, we have a completely different story emerging about this section. So that's a pretty big deal because whoever inserted that comma changed the meaning regarding meat and grain usage. Now, without that comma, all of a sudden, all of these other contradictions go away. The contradiction between Doctrine and Covenants section 49, which says any man who forbids to eat meat is not ordained of God. Why? Because it is pleasing under God that they should be used year-round, not only in times of cold, winter, or famine. Then also the contradiction between eating meat, consuming meat, as in Leviticus 10, being a holy practice, is again in harmony with D&C 89. And then as we go into 59 and other sections, God identifies that all these animals were ordained for the use of man, both for food and for clothing, and it's pleasing unto him that they be used for that purpose, for unto that end did he create them. And so without that comma, all of a sudden D&C 89 becomes in harmony with 49, 59, Leviticus 10, and all of the other scriptures that reference the consuming of meat and grains. So that's a pretty big deal. And you can look this up in the Joseph Smith archives. Just search Revelation, February 27th, 1833, or D&C 89. It's all there. So getting back to how this changes things, we can also see here, I guess I got the link already up, Book of Commandments, right here, shows the other earliest transcript, and there's no punctuation in this, and that comma is not there, and there's no clarification of a comma being needed to clarify or change the meaning. So the first two, here it is. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. It is pleasing unto me that they should be used only in times of winter, cold, or famine. Not. There it is. Okay. The page is, okay. It's a little bit hard to read. Yea, flesh also of beasts, and the fowls of the air, of I the Lord hath ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not, the T has been lost right there, not be used only in times of winter. Going to the next page. Or of cold or famine. All grains is ordained. So we're still in the grain section. Yeah, so both these manuscripts contain no punctuation that changed the meaning. So where did that punctuation come from? Well, here we have the story of scribes entering into church history in significant ways. Christ warned about scribes changing meanings, changing doctrines, or watering down doctrines in his time with the New Testament church. So scribes have been more active in church history than I had any idea until I started looking into this, in changing not only our history, but changing the doctrine to better conform with the history that the church wants to put forth, or the church historians. Here's some commentary regarding that. The Mormon leaders have made 3 important changes concerning the word of wisdom. In Joseph Smith's History of the Church, in one instance, Joseph Smith asked Brother Markham to get a pipe and some tobacco for the Apostle Willard Richards. Those words were replaced with the word medicine in the official history of the church. And in recent editions of History of the Church, you can only find that a pipe and some tobacco was replaced with medicine. Obviously, the church historians, or I don't know who this was, saw a problem with the official history stating that Brother Joseph asked Brother Markham to get him a pipe with some tobacco, because that's not reflective of the current church policy at the time. And so they changed that to medicine to obscure that fact. That's a problem. I don't like that. At another time, Joseph Smith related that he gave to some of the brethren a couple dollars with directions to replenish their supply of whiskey. This was a case where some of the brethren were accused of breaking the word of wisdom and sent to Joseph Smith to answer to these claims. And Brother Joseph, as prophet and president of the church, found that no evil had been done, and that he in fact gave them some money to replenish their bottle prior to their journey. But in modern editions of the history of the church, the words whiskey and with directions to replenish were altered or changed or covered up. The words were deleted from this reference to cover up the fact that Joseph Smith encouraged the brethren to disobey the word of wisdom, according to the cultural interpretation. In the third instance, Joseph Smith frankly admitted that he had drank a glass of beer at Moser's. Now, these words have been omitted in recent editions of History of the Church as well. So we have at least 3 examples in the history of the church, the, I think, 7-volume set, that is kind of a bedrock for scholarship, in which scribes or historians changed the actual circumstances of what happened in favor of reflecting better the current cultural doctrine of those things being against the word of wisdom. The Mormon Church forbids the use of tea, but according to Joseph Smith's diary, March 11th, 1843, Smith was fond of strong tea. In the office, Joseph said he had tea with his breakfast. His wife asked him if it was good. He said if it was a little stronger, he should like it better. When Mother Granger remarked, "It is so strong and good, I should think it would answer both for drink and for food." That reference was entirely omitted in the History of the Church, Volume 5, page 302. Yeah, historians messing with history to reflect the current thinking on what's right and wrong is teaching for doctrines the commandments of men, and then trying to impose those teachings on history by making it look like Joseph Smith and others also taught those same doctrines. That's problematic. So where did this comma come from? We actually have a little bit more information on that episode of Scribal policy. In D&C 49, we get some additional insights as we talked about to the use of meats. This was given in May of 1831, a couple of years before the word of wisdom, so it's a precursor to the word of wisdom, and it says this, and whoso forbiddeth to abstain from meats, that man should not eat the same, is not ordained of God. That right there should have been a red flag to scribes. By putting in that comma, they're saying that you shouldn't eat meat only under these circumstances. But I don't know if they consulted other scriptures when regarding that. They probably only consulted teachings of presidents of the church prior to them, because that seems to be where we get our doctrinal insights from, regardless of whether it's scripturally based or opinion based. Precepts of men, right? And behold, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and that which cometh of the earth is ordained for the use of man for food and for raiment, and that he might have in abundance. Notice there's no time limit on this or under any other circumstances. But it is not given that one man should possess that which is above another, wherefore the world lieth in sin. So this is where God interjects his commentary on what is right and what is wrong, specifically what is sin, and possessing that which is above another, wherefore the world lieth in sin. This is the opposite of charity, right? We shouldn't possess more than another. And woe be unto that man that sheddeth blood, or that wasteth flesh, and hath no need. That's strong language. The Lord inserts a woe into here, so we need to pay attention when it's woe. It's like, hold on, pay attention. This is a big deal. This is important. There's 3 tiers of woes. There's woe, 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 and woe, woe, woe. Woe meaning like this is in error, this is wrong, look out. Woe, woe means serious error, serious apostasy, and then woe, woe, woe usually denotes things that you don't come back from. So we get one woe regarding unto that man that sheddeth blood or wasteth flesh and hath no need. this puts all-you-can-eat buffets in a very negative light, because there's a lot of waste that goes on usually in that. Not just gluttony on one hand, but wasting flesh and not having a need. Now I'm going to tell you a story, an anecdotal story. I can't find any corroboration to this because it's controversial. Somebody whose opinion I trust, who worked in the church office building during President Kimball's tenure, related a story to me that in priesthood meeting on one occasion, President Kimball, after reading this verse and others, he spoke about wasting flesh, about wasting meat, and admonished the saints not to kill wild game for sport. That was against God's will. It was not pleasing to him. That it was not in harmony with the scriptures, and related that same in priesthood meetings, something to those effects. That wasting flesh, that hunting for sport, or hunting when there is no need to save your lives. I think it's how the scriptures read, except to save your lives. Yeah. It's a warning against wasting resources and food, especially meat, echoed in Joseph Smith's Revelation. Okay, yeah, this comes from Genesis 9:5, which is the JST version of Genesis 9, in which God tells Noah that blood shall not be shed only for meat, to save your lives, and the blood of every beast will I require at your hands. Blood shall not be shed only for meat, to save your lives, and the blood of every beast will I require at your hands. So if we're hunting for sport or for fun or for game, purely for sport and not to save our lives, then as that scripture reads, the Joseph Smith inspired version, that is wrong, and God will ask us to account. We'll have to account for the blood of every beast that we slay, if it's for subsistence to save our lives or not. Anyways, President Kimball somehow made reference to this in priesthood meeting, and what this friend told me was that the next day his office was flooded with phone calls and subsequent letters of stake presidents and bishops and area authorities and whatnot that basically took the tone and opinion that they would rather give up their temple recommend than their hunting license, and demanded that he recant his words. Because of such the uproar, and living in Utah and knowing how entrenched hunting is in this culture, that, I mean, it's a religion all of itself, a generational religion that's meticulously and dutifully passed on from one generation to the other. I can see how that would be received with a lot of animosity. So apparently President Kimball, or I don't know, the church authorities backed off of that teaching, and then it was omitted from the transcripts of that priesthood meeting. And that's why I can't find actual LDS sources for that story. But it seems to be in harmony with this principle that God's outlining in 89:49 and the JST 9:5 about how we should view meat, that it should be used sparingly to save our lives, and that excess, wasting flesh is a bad thing. We get one woe out of that. So where did the comma come from? Who entered it? And I've been able to trace it back to 1921. Big surprise. That's when President Grant had just won a big victory with his support of Prohibition, and it was taking taking place nationwide at that time. I think it was in 1919 that Utah, or 1918, that Utah passed its own version of prohibition, and then they joined the larger federal legislation shortly afterwards that made prohibition, the use of alcohol nationwide, against the law. So this was like a major revival time for the Word of Wisdom, and I've been focusing on the changes that were made at that time with alcohol, which were very significant, but it took a lot more digging to find out the changes with this comma, with meat and grains, and they went under this review and change at that same time. So in 1921, there was a committee of 5 apostles that completed recently an edition of the Book of Mormon, and they were preparing it for publication. And they also were tasked with preparing a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And this was led by James E. Talmage, who everybody knows. He's very well known. And he was noted that the previous editions of the Doctrine and Covenants contained, as he put it, many errors by way of omission. The most significant change that came out of his editing was the removal of first lectures of faith, which were attached to Doctrine and Covenants prior to 1921. Those were removed, which I think is very unfortunate because they give us so much more insights and make the Doctrine and Covenants make a lot more sense. Anyways, James E. Talmage and this committee removed the lectures of faith. They also expanded headnotes, revised footnotes, and divided pages into double columns. And one of the other many changes published in the revised 1921 edition was a new comma that appeared in verse 13 of section 89. And that comma we identified was inserted between the words use and only. And it was called by some at the time and later the vegetarian comma, because it essentially turns the Lord's will into you should be vegetarians only under extreme circumstances should you eat meat. So it was later labeled the vegetarian comma or the errant comma, and some people argued that the comma substantially changed the meaning of that verse at that time. But according to the church, that assertion was not supported, and they believe that they were in correction, not in error. That is according to Questioning the Comma in verse 13 of the Word of Wisdom, Interpreter, a Journal of Mormon Scripture in 2014 by Jane Birch. So I almost laughed out loud because it was so predictable that under President Grant's administration, right during this fury of reinterpretations regarding the Word of Wisdom concerning alcohol and the frenzy of prohibition that was taking hold of many members of the church, and especially the leadership at that time, would also bleed over into something that is blatantly wrong, blatantly a change. Changing the scriptures themselves by changing their very meaning simply by adding punctuation that most people didn't notice, but those that did raised a dissenting voice. But as most LDS cultural members do, they just fell in line and trust the brethren that, or trust this committee that they knew what they were doing. And we've been living with this comma ever since. And we've been living with the confusion that comes from the meats and grains all the way up until the interview with President Hinckley, where he was confronted regarding meats and commas by a caller. Why don't Mormons live this if they're supposed to be vegetarians? And he didn't have an answer for them. Because the scriptures are contradictory at this point, and that sows confusion. And when confusion sets in, that allows the adversary to work on us and weaken our faith in that regard. It's really, really tragic that that happened. So according to the Joseph Smith Papers commentary, they wrote this: many LDS church leaders have expressed their views on the subject of meat. In 1868, Church President Brigham Young counseled flesh should be used sparingly in famine and in cold. So that's where this justification, I believe, for the comma came in, that James E. Talmage and other consulted previous teachings of presidents of the church, not Joseph Smith, because we don't have, as far as I'm aware, I have not been able to find specific sermons reliably dictated on the word of wisdom. But with Brigham Young, he is quoted as such: flesh should also be used sparingly in famine and in cold. And Brigham Young, The True Church of Christ, Living Testimony, the Word of Wisdom, Journal of Discourses. The Word of Wisdom states that flesh also of beasts and fowls of the air are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto God that they should not be used only in times or of cold or famine. Unlike the injunctions against tobacco, alcohol, and hot drinks, however, compliance with this injunction has never been made mandatory. So Brigham Young onward, well, I shouldn't say onward, because not every president of the church taught this regarding consumption of meat. However, there's enough in the historical record to make a reasonable assumption that James E. Talmage consulted the teachings of previous presidents, starting with Brigham Young, and not the scriptures in his interpretation of how we should use meat. Because, I mean, D&C 49 directly refutes that. I'm really surprised that that was justified and then made it into print, and has been that way ever since. But that is the story of scribes. They wield a lot of power. Continuing in Church Historians JSP Archive commentary, though the Revelation instructed that meat was to be used sparingly, church members appear to have placed very little emphasis on that counsel. Maybe, I'm just speculating, maybe because they didn't believe it. Maybe they were taught by Joseph Smith the proper view of that, or how to properly adhere to it. Maybe they used D&C 49 as clarification to eating meat year-round. I mean, how would you quantify eating meat sparingly in the historical record without proportions being recorded? What is sparingly, right? How can you judge whether a previous leader or membership were actually eating meat sparingly or not? I mean, I don't know how you answer that. I don't think you can. Perhaps because this portion was rarely referenced by church leaders. Journals, reminiscences, and other personal records of the time that discuss specific provisions of the Word of Wisdom generally focus on the use of hot drinks, strong drinks, and tobacco rather than on the misuse or overuse of meat. The same is true of more official records and statements. In a noteworthy exception, Hiram Smith in 1842, Discourse on the Word of Wisdom, urged the saints in Nauvoo to attend to the Revelation's instructions regarding the use of meat and to be sparing of the life of animals. Notice he didn't advocate to be a vegetarian. He just advocated to be sparing to the life of animals, which is totally supported by JST 9.5, by D&C 49, and other scriptures. But we seem to read that and then fall right back into the rut of the cultural tradition. It's so hard to get that out of our heads, even for me. Fearful that many church members were following their old traditions, Hiram Smith promised health, vigor, strength, and wisdom to those who kept the word of wisdom. That was from the Word of Wisdom, which was printed in the Times and Seasons in 1842. So the misreading, misinterpretation persisted and was perpetuated by other leaders. See, if we take Brigham Young's counsel, if it's off just a little bit, then there's this unspoken rule in church hierarchy that others have told me about, that have worked in church hierarchy, that you don't contradict a previous leader. Even if that's wrong, even if they got something wrong, you don't contradict them. So that little nudge by Brigham Young off course about meat was picked up by subsequent leaders, and this is what I found. In 1868, Apostle George Q. Cannon said, "We are told that flesh of any kind is not suitable to man in the summertime, and ought to be eaten sparingly in the winter." It comes from Word of Wisdom, Fish Culture Dietetic, Journal of Discourses, 1868. From 1897 to 1901, Apostle and then Church President Lorenzo Snow repeatedly emphasized the importance of eating meat sparingly, teaching that church members should refrain from eating meat except in case of dire necessity. That's the position that President Kimball took that he got such backlash for, and that this should be seen in light of Smith's teaching that animals have spirits. That's interesting justification for that. You could have just referenced D&C 89 or 49 or 9:5 Genesis, but that's fine. In 1895, Snow stated, "Unless famine or extreme cold is upon us, we should refrain from the use of meat." Oh boy. Apostles George Teasdale taught the same thing and held that eating pork was a more serious breach of the word of wisdom than drinking tea or coffee. When Joseph F. Smith succeeded Snow as president of the church in 1901, he preached regularly against the unnecessary destruction of life and emphasized kindness to animals and the importance of stewardship humans have towards them. George Q. Cannon stated, "These birds and fish cannot speak, but they can suffer, and our God who created them knows their sufferings and will hold him who causes them to suffer unnecessarily to answer for it." President Joseph Fielding Smith said, "They, the animals, also were commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It was intended that all creatures should be happy in their several elements. Therefore, to take the life of these creatures wantonly is a sin before the Lord." So I found one reference by a scholar by the name of Foster that gave reference to President Kimball that said when he was president of the church, he devoted a general conference addressed to the ills of hunting. I don't think it was a whole general conference, but that seems to corroborate the story that I heard. So the Bible teaches this principle. In the King James Bible, Genesis 9:5 reads as this, "And surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man." Now that's a very confusing sentence. It's hard to extrapolate what the meaning behind that is, which is probably what led Joseph Smith to do an inspired translation of it. And his inspired translation recorded this, "But the blood of all flesh which I have given you for meat shall be shed upon the ground, which taketh life thereof, and the blood ye shall not eat. And surely blood shall not be shed only for meat to save your lives, and the blood of every beast will I require at your hands. And whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for man shall not shed the blood of man." So there will be an accounting for the blood we shed of beasts. So using these other scriptures, we can not only understand what D&C 89 is trying to teach us, because we have many other corroborating scriptures about the use of meat that is pleasing to God, that we should use it, but what God is concerned about is not whether we use it in times of cold, winter, or famine, but how we use it, that we don't waste flesh, that we eat meat to save our lives, and that we eat it sparingly with the attitude of thanksgiving, praising God in the act of actually doing that. Then it's a righteous thing and it is pleasing unto God. And taking into account all of those scriptures and what we understand about the use of meat and grains being to set aside for time of cold, winter, or famine, like Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, then we can be assured, I can rest assured, that that comma that was inserted by James E. Talmage in committee was not teaching true doctrine, was changing the doctrine and putting D&C 89 out of harmony with all the other scriptures. That is a conclusion I'm drawing from. You draw your own conclusion. Don't believe anything I say. because I have no authority and no special insight to revelation regarding D&C 89. I'm just advocating for taking the words of the Lord seriously, literally, and straightforward, and to stop imposing our own interpretive views upon that revelation, which just muddies the water and confuses everything.